My name is Wes Drake, and I want to tell you something about respect. Real respect is not given in the moment something impressive happens. Real respect is built slowly from 100 small things that nobody is watching, and nobody is counting, and nobody is counting, and nobody is keeping score, which is the only way it accumulates that means anything. I understood this because I had grown up in a family that did not give respect easily, and I had learned early that the only way to get it was to do things that deserved it, whether or not anyone was looking. That habit had followed me into 11 years of outer belt operations, and it was the habit that Chief Engineer Salvorn noticed eventually and reluctantly over the 6 months I spent on the research vessel Karath 7. Salvorn was the best engineer I had ever worked alongside. Not the most formally credentialed, not the highest ranked. The best in the sense that mattered, which was that she understood her ship at a level that went past knowledge into something closer to instinct, and she brought the full weight of that understanding to everything she did, whether the thing she was doing was significant or routine. She was also the most exacting person I had ever worked for, and she did not give her respect easily. She told me this on my first day. Not as a warning, as information. She was the kind of person who preferred to be clear about things so that nobody was operating on incorrect assumptions, and her view of human crew members was something she considered it fair to be clear about. She said she had worked alongside 2 human engineers before me. Both had been competent and reliable, and neither had earned her respect in the time they served. She said she was not expecting me to be different. She said she was telling me this not to discourage me, but because she thought it was more useful for me to know her starting position than to discover it gradually. I said I appreciated the clarity. She said most people found it off-putting. I said most people were more interested in being liked than in knowing where they stood. I was more interested in knowing where I stood. She looked at me for a moment with dark eyes that were doing assessment work. She said we would see. Then she showed me my assigned systems and my responsibilities and left me to it. I worked, not to impress her, not to change her starting position. I worked because the work needed doing, and I did it the way I always did it, thoroughly and carefully, and with the habit of going slightly past what was required to get to what was actually needed. The first thing Salvorn noticed was the maintenance log. I filed detailed logs, more detailed than the standard format required. Yes, one detailed than the standard format required. Not because anyone had asked for detail, but because I had always found that the detail in a maintenance log was where the useful information lived, and that a log without detail was a record that something had been done without a record of what had actually been found. She read my logs. I knew because the access timestamps on the files showed her reading them on evenings, when she was not on shift, which told me she was reading them on her own time. She did not say anything about this for 3 weeks. On the 23rd day, she stopped me in the engineering corridor and said the note in my day 14 log about the secondary coolant flow variation. I said yes. She said you flagged it as within tolerance but worth monitoring. I said yes. She said it had been in the log for 9 days before anyone else mentioned it. I said I was not certain it was significant. I flagged it in case it developed. She said it had developed. She said the variation I had noted on day 14 had progressed to a point where it was now a maintenance priority. She said catching it at day 14 instead of now had saved approximately 40 hours of repair work because the progression at day 14 was addressable with a minor adjustment, whereas now it required partial system disassembly. I said I'd not been certain it would develop. I just did not like the pattern. She said, what pattern? I said the variation was small, but it was occurring at a frequency that did not match any of the standard causes in the documentation. Variations that do not match standard causes are worth watching even when they are within tolerance because they suggest something the documentation has not accounted for. She looked at me. She said, you read the documentation. I said all of it. Before my first shift, she said the full engineering documentation for this vessel is 430 pages. I said I read quickly. She was quiet for a moment. She said she would note the log flag in the maintenance record. She walked away. That was the first time. The second time was 6 weeks later, and it was different in character, but the same in origin. The Kura 7 had been running a long survey loop through the outer Dravosi corridor, and we were 3 days from the return leg when we encountered a debris field that was not on the survey charts, which meant it was either new or had been there long enough that the last survey pass had missed it, and either way it was directly on our planned return route. Navigating through an uncharted debris field was not impossible for a ship of the Kurath 7's class, but it required careful sensor work and careful maneuvering, and it required the sensor data to be accurate, which was the problem. The debris field was generating an electromagnetic interference pattern that was affecting the forward sensor, answer, array in a way that made the readings unreliable. Not completely wrong. Not completely wrong. Partially wrong in a way that was more dangerous than completely wrong, because partially wrong data looked like data you could use and led to decisions based on information that was not fully accurate. The bridge crew knew the sensors were affected. What they did not have was a clear picture of exactly how affected, which made it difficult to apply the right correction factor to the readings. I was in the engineering section when the call came through for the senior engineer, and Sale Vorn was already on the bridge. I pulled up the sensor diagnostic from the engineering console and looked at the interference pattern and thought about the secondary relay architecture that I had spent a quiet afternoon 2 weeks ago tracing completely because I had been curious about a routing decision. That seemed unusual. The interference was hitting the primary forward array cleanly. What it was not hitting cleanly was the secondary relay feed from the lateral arrays, because the lateral array routing ran through a shielded conduit that the interference pattern was not aligned with. The lateral arrays were giving cleaner data than the forward array. They were also not being used because the navigation display was defaulting to the forward array as primary. I called the bridge. I said the lateral array feed through the secondary relay was partially shielded from the interference. If the navigation display was reconfigured to composite the lateral data with the forward data using the lateral as primary and the forward as supplementary, the resulting picture would be significantly more accurate than the current forward-only display. The bridge officer said, "Could I do that from engineering?" I said yes. It required a manual relay configuration change that was accessible from the engineering console. He said do it. I die. It. The navigation display on the bridge updated within 60 seconds, and the improved sensor picture let the bridge crew plot a route through the debris field with the kind of confidence that the forward-only picture had not been giving them. We cleared the field in 4 hours without incident. Sal Vorn came to the engineering section afterward. She stood in the doorway and looked at me and said the lateral array and looked at me and said the lateral array routing through the secondary relay. I said yes. She said, "How did you know about the shielded conduit?" I said I had traced the secondary relay architecture 2 weeks ago. The routing decision seemed unusual, and I wanted to understand why it had been made. She said, "Why?" I said because understanding why a design decision was made tells you what the design is intended to do. The shielded conduit routing in the lateral feed was an unusual choice unless it was intentional protection against interference. Once I understood that it was intentional, I remembered it when the interference situation arose. She was quiet. She said no one else on the ship knew about the shielded conduit routing. I said I do not know what other people know. She said, "I know what other people know," she said. "I am the chief engineer. I knew about it. Nobody else did." I said I found it by reading the design documentation. She said the secondary relay design documentation. She said the secondary relay design documentation is in a separate technical archive that requires a specific access request to view. Most crew members do not request it. I request all the technical documentation for systems I work on. She looked at me for a long moment. The engineering section was quiet around us, and the Kareth 7 ran her systems in the steady way she ran them when everything was correct and nothing needed immediate attention. Sale Vorn said, "I told you on your first day that I had worked alongside 2 human engineers before you." I said yes. She said I told you neither had earned my respect. I said yes. She said I want to revise that statement. I said yes. She said it is not that they did not earn my respect. They did adequate work, and adequate work has its own value. She said, what I mean when I say they did not earn my respect is that they never made me think differently about something I had already understood. They never added to my picture of the ship. They maintained what was assigned and resolved what was reported, and that was the entirety of their contribution. She paused. She said, "You have made me think differently about things twice in 6 weeks." She said the coolant flow flag, and today, she said both times you were operating on information you had gathered on your own time for reasons that had nothing to do with the immediate situation. She said that is not what adequate work looks like. I said, I just read the documentation and paid attention. She said, everyone has access to the documentation. I said, not everyone reads it. She said, no. She said, they do not. She was quiet for a moment. She said, Wes Drake. I said, yes. She said, on my first day I told you my starting position. I said, yes. She said, I am telling you my current position. I said, yes. She said, it is different. I said, I know. She said, I thought you should know that I know is different. I looked at her. She said most people work to change someone's starting position and never find out if they succeeded. She said you did not appear to be working to change mine. I said I was not. She said then, why? I said because the work deserved doing properly, regardless of what position you were starting from. Your position was yours. My work was mine. She held my gaze with those dark eyes for a long moment. Then she said that is either the most professional thing I have heard or the most human. I said probably both. She almost did something with her expression that was warm and genuine and that I thought she did not do often. She turned and walked back toward the main engineering section and stopped at the junction. She said the secondary relay documentation. I said yes. She said there is a third archive. Structural integration records from the original build. Most engineers never look at it. She said I recommend it. She walked away. I turned back to my console and submitted the access request for the Structural Integration Archive. It was approved in 4 minutes, which told me she had pre-authorized it before she walked away. I started reading. Outside the Carrot 7, the outer belt moved in its slow and patient way, and inside the ship, everything was running the way it was supposed to run, and somewhere in the archive there was a document that contained something worth knowing, and I was going to find it. That was the whole thing. That had always been the whole thing. I kept reading.